Hello, I am Vladimir Shirogorov, a historian, and author of the books War on the Eve of Nations, Conflicted Militaries in Eastern Europe, 1450–1500, and Strategies of Ukrainian War, 1500–1800, that's now in print. It's webinar 4 to my course, Military Strategy for Warfare, Politics and Business, that I plan to open for booking at the beginning of May and start to teach at the end of May. The topic of this webinar is really very interesting and burning. It's the revolution in military affairs and everyday life, how the political and business strategies follow the military change and borrow from it. War influence our life not only through the news channels or by military spendings, but it's also synchronized with development of society and relations inside societies. And it's important to understand this topic to make the right strategies in our personal life, in our business and political careers. And it's especially important for the military leaders to understand this parallel of society and war, to make the right strategies for application of war as one of the mightiest tools in the human set. So, the revolution in military affairs and everyday life. Today I discuss together with you two outstanding topics. First is the military revelations in the mid-1960s and the strategies of general prosperity, and the military revelations in the mid-1980s and the strategies of privileged superiority. I started to research on these topics, participating in preparing the very important volume, The Military Revolution and Revolution in Military Affairs, that was published in Germany in 2022. It is a book that is attentively studied by not only military leaders, but also the politicians and scholars, because it first opened the important discussion on new means of war, such as artificial intelligence and its combination with unmanned systems of warfare. And second, it is the book that first started to compare different periods in the humankind history of the military transformations, combining them with their social and economic surrounding to find the general pattern of synchronization and parallel moves in the military and society. I start today's discussion with describing an atmosphere of the military explorations in the Soviet Union in the 1960s and 1980s, because the Soviet Union was the source of the principal military innovations in the second half of the 20th century, and later Russia became the source of the principal military revelations at the beginning of the 21st century that changed not only application of force, not only warfare, but also society, politics and business. And I link the military innovations and its atmosphere with two prominent names of the Soviet military intellectuals and generals, military leaders, marshals Vasily Sokolovsky and Nikolay Ogarkov. They explored on the changes in warfare, respectively in the mid-1960s and mid-1980s, one after another. They came to different conclusions and made different proposals. They changed warfare and society. Both of them were high intellectuals, but first of all, they were warriors with fighting experience in the Second World War, and as the military leaders must be, they were self-confident, aggressive, and looked for route of victory for their country, the Soviet Union. Sokolovsky faced the Cold War in the period when this kind of confrontation took its shape. It was a combination of the standoff of conventional armed forces in Europe and development of the global striking potential of nuclear missiles and other strategic weapons. They were combined with the subversion actions in the economy and ideology, and they also drove to some regional conflicts like in Korea, Vietnam, Cuba, and later Afghanistan. Sokolovsky, as most of the Soviet military leaders and politicians in the 1960s, believed that the Cold War once had to turn to the real war, to the nuclear doomsday, because the United States and the Western camp of liberal capitalism needed war to check the development of the Soviet Union and its socialist allies as a superior social formation, and looking for inevitability of nuclear war, he looked for receipt for his country, the Soviet Union, to prevail. Sokolovsky studied the probable scenarios of the nuclear clash with the West, and he came to three very important conclusions that allowed him to claim that introduction of nuclear weapons turned warfare resulted in the revolution in warfare. He found three main differences of the new age of warfare, of the age of nuclear warfare, with the age of conventional warfare that preceded it. The first difference was appearance of new kind of military action. If the preceding military conflicts were decided by two different kinds of military actions of armed struggle, defense and offense, now the new kind of military action appeared. It is the strategic nuclear missile strike at the depths of the enemy's territory. It was not offensive and not defensive action. It was a new kind of military action. Appearance of this new kind of military action changed the traditional logic and timing of warfare. If in the preceding conflicts the period after the destruction of the enemy's front troops was the most important for outcome of war, because it was the period when the operational destruction of the enemy must have been converted to the strategic destruction of the enemy state. Now, the nuclear strike at the depths of the enemy territory, at the enemy's political and economic centers, must precede the clash of the front troops. And if in the preceding conventional conflicts, combat, battle, and the operation decided the strategic development of war, now the strategic strike at the enemy's depths decided how the battles, operations, and combat would develop. These three conclusions pushed Sokolovsky to criticize, to oppose the Western military thinkers that lectured that nuclear war had a little difference with the preceding conventional warfare, only it would have some a little bit bigger destructions and losses. Sokolovsky claimed that the difference between conventional warfare and nuclear warfare, due to his revelations, was radical, and some big countries could cease to exist in a few minutes during the initial period of nuclear war. The revelations of Sokolovsky were attentively studied in the United States. And now I discuss the atmosphere of military revelations, of military transformation in the United States in the 1970s and 1990s. I discuss it connecting with two prominent figures of American military thinkers, Henry Kissinger and Andrew Marshall. These two figures developed the changes, the transformation of the American military in the second half of the 20th century, despite of the fact that they were no military. Henry Kissinger sought an action fighting against the German Nazis with the American military intelligence, and Andrew Marshall was a completely civil figure. They were the scholars of international relations that continued their career with the American administration, Kissinger in its international department and Marshall in Pentagon. They were scholars, not warriors, and their main character was analytical and not military aggressive. However, they understood the revelations of Soviet marshals well. Kissinger analyzed the revelations of Sokolovsky and Sokolovsky doctrine of nuclear warfare, of the radical changes of possible outcome of war that the introduction of nuclear weapons brought. Kissinger faced the Cold War at its peak. Confrontation between the Soviet Union and the West came to a standstill in the 1970s, and according to revelations of Sokolovsky, it was suicidal to decide this confrontation with a nuclear weapon. Revelations of Sokolovsky coincided with Kissinger's research on the balance of power in Europe in the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars. Kissinger adopted Sokolovsky's doctrine and he pushed ahead the relaxation of the American-Soviet relations and American rapprochement with China. These two international and military actions became the pillars of the Western prosperity in the 1970s and 1980s. According to, or in parallel to the Sokolovsky's doctrine, the Western society changed to peaceful development. It was focused on the prosperity of the middle class that composed the majority of the Western population. The corporations came to cooperation for mutual profits, and the politicians started to discuss the convergence of different political lines into the united, integrated line of general prosperity. However, the development of military science, the development of warfare and development of military strategy didn't stop. The next portion of revelations was made by the Soviet Marshal Nikolay Ogarkov, who became the head of the Soviet General Staff at the end of 1970s. Ogarkov faced completely different Cold War than Sokolovsky faced 2 decades before. It was really capsized. The fast economic, social, scientific and technological development of the United States of America and the West in the 1970s and 1980s questions the alleged superiority of the Soviet socialism over the liberal capitalist society. And now it became clear that not the Western camp, but the Soviet Union probably would need war to check the development of more successful competitor. However, according to Sokolovsky's revelation, it was suicidal to use a nuclear warfare to check the development of the imperialist countries. And Ogarkov started to study again the conventional warfare. He made the conclusion that it was possible to achieve victory over the West in conventional warfare by introducing new technologies, new innovations to warfare, to military activity that were made during the decades from the end of the Second World War. He focused on such new developments like computerized management of the troops, satellite reconnaissance, high precision weapons, and unmanned systems of fighting. He not only developed some theory of new generation of warfare, but practiced it during large military training of the Warsaw Pact in the beginning of the 1980s. And his military revelations started the period of so-named revolution in military affairs that's connected with his name. Revelations of Ogarkov were studied in the United States by another advanced scholar. He was Andrew Marshall. Andrew Marshall studied Ogarkov's revelation, presiding over the Special Analytical Group in Pentagon, and they decided that the transformation of the American military according to Ogarkov's revelation is urgent. The United States became a pioneer in development and implementation of the new tools of warfare on which Ogarkov focused. Andrew Marshall faced the overwhelming collapse of the Soviet Union that cleaned the global strategic scene for the new Western strategies, and development of the new tools of warfare changed the Western military patterns in a radical way. Now, not global warfare, the global confrontation and clash, nuclear clash with the Soviet Union and the socialist bloc became the prime pattern of the Western military strategy. The Western military strategy regionalized. Now it was focused on the regional conflicts in the limited theater of operation with high precision weapon and application of the American and Western superiority in the scientific kinds of warfare to fasten the American global leadership. However, in parallel, or due to the military changes, due to the changes of military doctrine, the Western society started to change as well. The society of the general prosperity broke to smaller social and political groups, hostile political and social groups that started to compete over the political power and economic positions for their egotist interests. The middle class that formerly prospered turned into the poorer majority of society, and a small slice of extra rich people who accumulated most of the Western economic and financial wealth. Corporations started fierce market wars, and the politics became aggressive, hostile, and antagonistic. However, it was not a final of the military development in the second half of the 20th century and at the beginning of the 21st century. The new tools of warfare emerged and the new military doctrine appeared. It's the doctrine labeled hybrid warfare. It's connected with the name of another Russian military thinker, the current chief of the Russian General Staff, Valery Gerasimov. This new concept, new strategy, new military strategy is closely connected with the current changes in society, in the strategies that the current today politicians, businessmen, and all people who are working for their commitment must to attend. It's a topic of my next webinar with the headline, the military revelations in the mid-2010s, hybrid warfare, and the strategy of each against the rest. I invite you to this webinar in a week. I am Vladimir Shirogorov, historian, and author of the books War on the Eve of Nations, Conflicted Militaries in Eastern Europe, 1450-1500, and Strategies of Ukrainian War, 1500-1800, that's now in print. Subscribe to my channel and attend my webinars, and I invite you to my course. Goodbye.